You call that a watch? Ryan Pierce leaned forward, eyes locked onto Morgan Freeman's wrist. His smirk was sharp, practiced, designed to entertain the crowd at someone else's expense. The audience chuckled, eager for the veteran host's next jab. Across from him, Morgan Freeman sat still, hands resting lightly on the armrests of his chair. The deep-set lines on his face held wisdom, patience, yet his fingers idly traced the worn leather strap of the watch on his wrist. A watch that to Ryan looked completely out of place. Ryan gestured to it with a scoff. "Come on, Morgan. A man of your stature? You could buy any luxury watch in the world. Rolex, Patek, Vacheron. But instead, you're wearing… what? Something out of a garage sale?" The audience laughed. A few people clapped. The cameramen, sensing a viral moment, zoomed in on the scuffed, time-worn piece strapped to Freeman's wrist. Morgan didn't flinch. "Money buys a watch," he said, voice steady as stone. "But it doesn't buy time." Ryan blinked. His grin faltered just slightly. The audience quieted, unsure if they were supposed to laugh or lean in. Morgan lifted his wrist, turning it so the studio lights caught the tiny crack in the glass, the faded engraving on the back. His fingers brushed it softly, reverently. "This," he said, "is the last thing my father ever gave me." The room stilled. Ryan shifted in his chair, opening his mouth as if to say something, maybe a joke, maybe an apology, but nothing came out. The weight in Morgan's voice, the quiet gravity in his eyes, had sucked the air straight out of the conversation. He wasn't done. "You see an old watch, Ryan. I see every lesson my father ever taught me. I see late nights, long talks, hands that worked to the bone so I could have a better life. And when I check the time on this watch, I don't see hours or minutes. I see memories." Ryan swallowed. For the first time in his career, he had underestimated the wrong man. Because what Morgan Freeman said next, it changed everything. If you believe respect should be earned, comment 1. If you think money is everything, comment 0. Ryan Pierce leaned forward, his smirk widening as he tapped his fingers against the sleek glass table. The audience, sensing the beginning of another one of his infamous jabs, chuckled in anticipation. This was his playground, his domain. He'd spent years tearing down politicians, celebrities, and influencers, turning their discomfort into viral entertainment. And tonight, he had a new target, Morgan Freeman. The legendary actor sat across from him, composed as always, his hands resting lightly on the armrests of his chair. But Ryan wasn't interested in his storied career or his voice, which had narrated some of the greatest moments in cinematic history. No, his eyes were fixated on one thing, a watch. Not just any watch, an old, battered timepiece with a scratched face and a faded leather strap, something that looked like it belonged in a pawn shop's discard pile rather than on the wrist of one of the most accomplished men in Hollywood. Ryan leaned in, gesturing toward it with a scoff. "Morgan, help me understand something. You've played billionaires, you've earned millions, and yet, you walk onto my set wearing that?" A few audience members snickered, some clapped, already entertained by Ryan's sharp-tongued wit. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the contrast. Morgan Freeman, dressed immaculately in a tailored navy suit, and that watch, a relic that looked out of place. Ryan wasn't done. "Look, I get nostalgia, I really do," he continued, feigning sympathy. "But let's be honest here. A man at your level, you could have a Rolex, a Patek, hell, even something custom-made just for you. So I gotta ask, is this some kind of statement? A minimalist thing? Or did you just forget to upgrade?" Laughter filled the studio. Morgan didn't laugh. Instead, he exhaled slowly, his fingers absently tracing the watch's rim as if feeling something only he could understand. His expression didn't change, no flash of anger, no visible discomfort, just patience, the kind of patience that only a man who has seen life could wear so effortlessly. "Ryan," he said finally, voice deep, steady, "tell me something. Do you own a watch?" Ryan blinked, caught off guard. He glanced down at his wrist, where a gleaming, diamond-encrusted Audemars Piguet sat snugly against his skin. He grinned, raising his arm slightly so the light could catch the luxury piece. "Of course. You think I'd show up without one?" Morgan nodded as if considering something. Then, with deliberate slowness, he lifted his own wrist, turning the watch slightly so the studio lights illuminated the tiny imperfections. The worn leather, the small crack in the glass, the subtle engraving on the back. "This," he said, voice unwavering, "is the last thing my father ever gave me." Silence. It came fast and hard, swallowing the laughter like a wave extinguishing a flame. The audience, moments ago entertained, now sat stiff and quiet. Even Ryan's smirk wavered, if only for a fraction of a second. Morgan continued, "You see an old watch. I see the hands of a man who worked every day of his life to give me a better one. I see late nights, early mornings, and calloused fingers that held mine when I was too young to understand what sacrifice really meant." Ryan shifted in his seat. This wasn't what he had planned. He had expected a lighthearted jab, a witty comeback, something to keep the energy playful, engaging. But Morgan Freeman was not playing. "You talk about upgrading," Morgan said, his tone measured. "But tell me, Ryan, how do you upgrade something priceless?" The question hung in the air, heavy, demanding. Ryan opened his mouth, but for the first time in his career, words failed him. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. Some were leaning forward in their seats, others exchanged glances. Even the cameramen who had spent years filming celebrities knew they were capturing something different tonight, something real. Morgan's fingers lightly brushed the surface of the watch again and his eyes softened. "When my father passed," he said, voice quieter now, "this was all I had left of him. He didn't leave behind millions, he didn't have stocks or businesses or a name that would make headlines, but he left this." Ryan swallowed. The tension in the studio was thick, pressing down on everyone like an invisible weight. He cleared his throat, grasping at something, anything to regain control. I didn't mean to... Look, I was just joking around, Morgan." Morgan lifted his gaze, meeting Ryan's eyes. "Were you?" Ryan hesitated, because for the first time in a long time he wasn't sure. The weight of Morgan's words settled over the room. People in the audience fidgeted in their seats, eyes darting between the host and his guest. It was the kind of moment that forced people to reflect, to wonder how often they had judged something or someone without understanding the story behind it. And then, just when the tension couldn't get any thicker, Morgan did something unexpected. He smiled. It wasn't mocking, it wasn't triumphant. It was understanding. "You're not the first to judge something by its cover, Ryan, and you won't be the last," he said, voice calm, almost forgiving. "But if there's one thing I've learned in all my years, it's this. Value isn't in the price tag. It's in the story." Ryan exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. He knew without a doubt that this interview was no longer his to control. And then Morgan said something that would haunt Ryan for a long, long time. "I don't need a watch to tell me what time it is, Ryan. But you?" He paused, just long enough for the moment to sink in. "Maybe it's time you start paying attention." The audience erupted, not in laughter but in something deeper. Applause, cheers, some even wiping their eyes, caught off guard by the raw truth they had just witnessed. Ryan sat frozen, hands gripping the desk. He had spent years tearing people down, but tonight he had learned something new. Respect isn't bought. It isn't flaunted. It isn't about brands or luxury or wealth. Respect is earned. And Morgan Freeman, he had just taught that lesson in the most unforgettable way. What happened next? No one could have predicted. And when the truth finally came out, it changed everything. Ryan Pierce had always prided himself on control. His show was his domain, a place where he dictated the pace, the mood, the narrative. But tonight something was slipping. He could feel it. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted, no longer an easygoing, laughter-filled interview, but something deeper, weightier, something he hadn't prepared for. Morgan Freeman still sat across from him, calm and composed, his fingers lightly resting on the old watch that had just silenced an entire room. Ryan forced a chuckle, an attempt to reclaim his usual bravado. "Well, Morgan, I gotta admit, that was unexpected," he said, shifting in his seat. "I mean, we're just talking about a watch here." Morgan tilted his head slightly, his deep brown eyes studying Ryan with quiet intensity. "Are we?" Ryan's grin faltered. The audience was no longer chuckling. They weren't shifting uncomfortably nor whispering among themselves. They were waiting, hanging on to every single word Morgan Freeman spoke. Ryan cleared his throat, pressing forward. "Look, I get it," he continued, waving a dismissive hand. "Sentimental value, memories, all that. But at the end of the day, isn't success about moving forward, upgrading, leaving the past where it belongs?" Morgan exhaled, slow and measured, before leaning forward just slightly. "Let me ask you something, Ryan," he said, voice rich and smooth, but carrying the weight of something unspoken. "What's the most expensive thing you own?" Ryan blinked, caught off guard. Well, he glanced at the glittering watch on his own wrist, the custom-tailored suit, the designer shoes. He had plenty to choose from. "My car, I guess," he finally answered. "It's a custom Bugatti, one of a kind." Morgan nodded as if filing the answer away. "And how often do you drive it?" Ryan hesitated. "I mean, not that often. It mostly sits in my garage. It's more of a collector's piece, really." Morgan smiled knowingly. "Ah," he said softly. "So you spent all that money on something that just sits there?" A few chuckles rippled through the audience, not at Ryan's expense, but at the sheer simplicity of the question. Ryan felt a flicker of irritation. He wasn't the one who was supposed to be on the defensive here. "That's not the point," he argued. "It's about owning something valuable, something that represents success." Morgan leaned back, folding his hands together. "And yet," he said, "that car doesn't tell a single story about you. It doesn't hold your father's lessons. It doesn't remind you where you came from. It doesn't carry the weight of time." Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but Morgan wasn't finished. "You see, Ryan, people spend their whole lives chasing things they think will define them. They climb, they accumulate, they surround themselves with luxury. But at the end of the day, when all the noise fades, when there's no audience, no cameras, no show, do you know what's left?" Silence. Morgan lifted his wrist again, the aged watch catching the light just enough for everyone to see its imperfections. The worn leather strap, the tiny crack in the glass. "Memories," he said. "Legacy. The things that money can't buy and time can't replace." The room was completely still. Even Ryan, who had spent his entire career finding the perfect retort, was at a loss for words. And then, from the back of the audience, a voice broke through the silence. "My dad gave me his watch before he passed away, too." All heads turned toward the speaker, an older gentleman in the front row, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His voice was rough, thick with emotion. "It wasn't fancy," he continued. "Just some old Timex he wore every day, but when I put it on, I still feel like he's with me." A murmur spread through the crowd. Another person spoke up. "I still have my grandfather's ring," a woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not worth much, but it's priceless to me." Ryan looked around, watching as one by one, people began nodding, murmuring in agreement. Something was happening, something real, and for the first time in a long time, Ryan Pierce was not in control of the narrative. He shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck before forcing out a nervous laugh. All right, he said, trying to lighten the mood. "I guess we're getting a little deeper than I expected tonight." Morgan simply smiled. "Maybe it's time we do." The studio fell into another heavy silence. Ryan exhaled, glancing down at his own expensive watch, the one he had bought not because it meant something, but because it looked good on camera. And then, with a hesitance he had never felt before, he asked, "Do you ever think about buying a new one? You know, just to keep it safe?" Morgan's smile softened, but his answer was immediate. "No," he said simply, "because if I ever stop wearing it, I might forget why I started." Ryan didn't know why, but those words hit him in a way nothing else had. For the first time in his life, he found himself questioning something he had never questioned before. The things he owned, the things he valued, the things he thought mattered. And suddenly, the glimmering watch on his own wrist felt empty. The audience remained silent, waiting, watching. And Morgan, He just sat there calm as ever, because he knew. He had just planted a seed in the mind of a man who thought he had it all figured out. And when the truth was finally revealed, no one would ever look at him the same way again. Ryan Pierce wasn't used to this feeling. He had built his career on confidence, on knowing exactly what to say, exactly when to say it, and exactly how to get the audience to hang on his every word. But right now, the room didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to the man sitting across from him. Morgan Freeman hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't lashed out or humiliated Ryan in return, but somehow, with nothing but calm words and an old, worn-out watch, he had completely shifted the energy in the studio. Ryan tried to regain control. "All right, Morgan," he said, forcing a smirk. "I get it. It's sentimental. It's important to you. But at the end of the day, don't you think success is about moving forward? About upgrading?" Morgan tilted his head slightly as if considering the question. Then, with that signature baritone, he replied, "Moving forward doesn't mean forgetting where you came from, Ryan." A few murmurs rippled through the audience. Ryan chuckled, but it didn't have the same bite as before. "Okay, but come on, you can appreciate nice things, right? A man like you, with everything you've accomplished, you don't need to hold on to a busted old watch." Morgan simply smiled, lifting his wrist again and gently tapping the glass face of the watch. "You see a busted watch," he said. "I see a lifetime." Ryan blinked. Morgan leaned forward slightly, his voice smooth but unwavering. "This watch has been through everything with me. It was on my wrist the first time I stepped on a stage. It was there when I got my first big role. It sat on my father's nightstand every night until the day he left this world. And now," he turned the watch slightly so the light reflected off the crack in the glass. "Now it reminds me of who I am, where I come from, and the man who made me who I am today." The audience sat still. Even the cameramen barely moved. Ryan shifted in his seat, crossing his arms. "I mean, sure, but that's just nostalgia. You're Morgan Freeman. You could afford 1,000 watches just like that one." Morgan's eyes met his, steady and knowing. "Could I?" he asked simply. Ryan hesitated. He wasn't sure what Morgan meant, but something about the way he said it made him uneasy. Morgan exhaled slowly, then leaned back into his chair. "Ryan, let me ask you something," he said. "What's the most expensive thing you own?" Ryan frowned. I guess my Bugatti," he admitted, adjusting his cufflink. Morgan nodded. "And how often do you drive it?" Ryan smirked. "Not that often. It's a collector's item." Morgan's lips curled into a knowing smile. "So you spent all that money on something that just sits there?" A few quiet chuckles came from the audience. Ryan felt heat creep up his neck. He waved a dismissive hand. "That's different," he said quickly. "That car represents success. It shows how far I've come." Morgan gave a slow nod, his fingers brushing against the worn leather of his watch strap. "And yet," he said, "it tells you nothing about who you are." Ryan's jaw tightened. Morgan wasn't mocking him. He wasn't being cruel. But somehow his words cut deeper than any insult could. The silence in the room felt heavier now. "People chase things, Ryan," Morgan continued. "They think if they just have more money, more power, more status, then they'll finally feel whole. But let me ask you this." He leaned in, his voice softer now. "When you're alone, when the cameras are off, when there's no audience clapping, does any of it really matter?" Ryan swallowed hard. He knew what he was supposed to say. He was supposed to brush it off, to make a joke, to keep the show moving. But for some reason, the words didn't come. The air in the studio had shifted. The audience wasn't waiting for Ryan's next clever comeback. They were waiting for the truth. And the worst part? So was he. Morgan smiled gently, as if he already knew the battle going on inside Ryan's head. "You asked me why I still wear this watch," he said. "It's because when I check the time, I don't just see hours and minutes. I see a life well spent. I see love. I see sacrifice. I see the man who taught me that respect isn't measured by wealth. It's measured by how you use the time you have." Ryan exhaled, glancing down at the sparkling, diamond-encrusted watch on his own wrist. It was worth more than some people made in a year, and yet, it suddenly felt so much less valuable. He looked back up at Morgan, and for the first time all night, he didn't know what to say. The audience remained frozen, waiting, watching, and then Morgan said something that made the entire room hold its breath. "I don't need a watch to tell me what time it is, Ryan." A pause. A heartbeat. "But maybe it's time you start paying attention." For the first time in his career, Ryan Pierce felt completely out of his depth. The cameras were still rolling, the audience still watching, but the energy in the studio had shifted entirely. This was no longer his show, no longer a game of quick-witted jabs and clever comebacks. Morgan Freeman had turned the conversation into something else. Something real. Ryan swallowed hard, gripping the armrest of his chair. He had spent years mastering the art of control, of steering interviews in whatever direction he wanted. But this was uncharted territory. Morgan sat across from him, unwavering, his fingers still lightly tracing the edges of his worn watch. The same watch Ryan had mocked just minutes ago, the same watch that now held the room captive. Ryan exhaled sharply, forcing himself to push forward. "Okay," he said, forcing a small chuckle. "So it's sentimental, I get it. But come on, Morgan, at the end of the day, isn't success about progress? About building something new instead of holding on to the past?" Morgan tilted his head slightly, his eyes calm but piercing. "Tell me, Ryan," he said smoothly, "what's the point of building something new if you don't remember why you started?" Ryan hesitated. He hated hesitating. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The plan was simple. Bring on a big-name guest, throw in some playful banter, maybe push a few buttons for entertainment. But now he was the one being questioned. And the worst part, he didn't have an answer. Morgan leaned forward slightly, his deep voice cutting through the silence. "I've met a lot of people in my lifetime, Ryan. Men who had everything, money, power, fame. But do you know what they all had in common?" Ryan cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "What?" Morgan exhaled. "They were never satisfied." The audience sat frozen, hanging on to every word. "They had all the wealth in the world," Morgan continued, "but they spent their lives chasing more. A bigger house, a faster car, a shinier watch. And do you know what happened when they finally got it?" Ryan didn't respond, because deep down he already knew the answer. "Nothing," Morgan said, "because none of it ever meant anything." Ryan clenched his jaw. He could feel the weight of the conversation pressing down on him, forcing him to confront things he had spent years ignoring. He looked down at his own wrist. The expensive diamond-encrusted timepiece gleamed under the studio lights, perfect and untouched. A symbol of everything he had worked for. And yet, for the first time, it felt completely meaningless. Morgan leaned back, watching him carefully. "You see, Ryan, success isn't just about moving forward," he said. "It's about knowing where you stand." Ryan inhaled deeply, struggling to maintain his composure. "All right," he said, gripping the table slightly. "So you're saying money doesn't matter? That success isn't important?" Morgan smiled, softly, knowingly. "No," he said, "I'm saying money should be a tool, not a purpose. Success should be a journey, not a destination. And if you spend your whole life measuring yourself by what you own instead of who you are, then you'll always be empty." Ryan let out a slow breath. The audience was no longer just watching a show, they were witnessing something. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, a single voice broke the silence. "I lost my father last year." The room shifted. Ryan turned, scanning the audience until his eyes landed on a man in the third row. Middle-aged, wearing a simple button-down, his hands folded tightly in his lap. "Before he passed," the man continued, his voice thick with emotion, "he gave me his wedding ring. It's not expensive, not fancy, but I wear it every day, because when I look at it, I remember him." Morgan nodded, his expression filled with understanding. Another voice spoke up. "My grandmother gave me a locket when I was 10, a woman added, her voice trembling. "I still have it. It's the only thing of hers I have left." More murmurs spread through the audience. People glanced at each other, suddenly remembering their own keepsakes, their own stories, their own pieces of the past that meant more than any material wealth ever could. Ryan looked around, feeling something shift inside him. This was no longer about watches, no longer about money. This was about people, about the things that truly mattered. He turned back to Morgan, his confidence shaken. He started, then stopped. Morgan waited patiently, no judgment in his eyes. Ryan exhaled. "I don't know why I wear this watch," he admitted, his fingers grazing the expensive metal. "I bought it because I could." Morgan nodded as if he had expected that answer all along. "And has it ever made you feel whole?" Ryan didn't answer, because he couldn't. The audience watched, waiting, sensing that something monumental was happening. Not just in the studio, but inside the man who had spent his life measuring worth in dollars and diamonds. Morgan gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "It's never too late to start valuing the things that truly last, Ryan." Ryan swallowed hard, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he had ever valued the right things at all. The cameras kept rolling, millions of people were watching, and what happened next? It would change everything, because the next words out of Ryan Pierce's mouth would leave the entire world stunned. The studio was silent, not the kind of silence that comes from boredom, but the kind that settles into your bones, the kind that makes you listen, makes you feel. Ryan Pierce sat there, staring down at the expensive watch on his wrist. Moments ago, he had worn it with pride as a symbol of his success, his status. Now it felt like nothing more than an accessory. Across from him, Morgan Freeman remained calm, patient, allowing the weight of the moment to sink in. He had nothing left to prove. He had already said everything that needed to be said. Now the only thing left was for Ryan to decide what to do with it. Ryan cleared his throat, forcing himself to speak. "I don't know why I bought this watch." His voice was quieter now, missing its usual bravado. "I guess I thought if I had enough, I'd finally feel like I made it." Morgan gave a small nod. "And do you?" Ryan exhaled, looking around the room, at the audience, at the cameras, at the expectant faces waiting for him to respond. But for the first time in his career, he didn't care about them. He cared about the truth. "All right," he said, gripping the table slightly. "So you're saying money doesn't matter? That success isn't important?" Morgan smiled, softly, knowingly. "No," he said, "I'm saying money should be a tool, not a purpose. Success should be a journey, not a destination. And if you spend your whole life measuring yourself by what you own instead of who you are, then you'll always be empty." Ryan let out a slow breath. The audience was no longer just watching a show, they were witnessing something. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, a single voice broke the silence. "I lost my father last year." The room shifted. Ryan turned, scanning the audience until his eyes landed on a man in the third row. Middle-aged, wearing a simple button-down, his hands folded tightly in his lap. "Before he passed," the man continued, his voice thick with emotion, "he gave me his wedding ring. It's not expensive, not fancy, but I wear it every day, because when I look at it, I remember him." Morgan nodded, his expression filled with understanding. Another voice spoke up. "My grandmother gave me a locket when I was 10, a woman added, her voice trembling. "I still have it. It's the only thing of hers I have left." More murmurs spread through the audience. People glanced at each other, suddenly remembering their own keepsakes, their own stories, their own pieces of the past that meant more than any material wealth ever could. Ryan looked around, feeling something shift inside him. This was no longer about watches, no longer about money. This was about people, about the things that truly mattered. He turned back to Morgan, his confidence shaken. He started, then stopped. Morgan waited patiently, no judgment in his eyes. Ryan exhaled. "I don't know why I wear this watch," he admitted, his fingers grazing the expensive metal. "I bought it because I could." Morgan nodded as if he had expected that answer all along. "And has it ever made you feel whole?" Ryan didn't answer, because he couldn't. The audience watched, waiting, sensing that something monumental was happening. Not just in the studio, but inside the man who had spent his life measuring worth in dollars and diamonds. Morgan gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "It's never too late to start valuing the things that truly last, Ryan." Ryan swallowed hard, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he had ever valued the right things at all. The cameras kept rolling, millions of people were watching, and what happened next? It would change everything, because the next words out of Ryan Pierce's mouth would leave the entire world stunned. The studio was silent, not the kind of silence that comes from boredom, but the kind that settles into your bones, the kind that makes you listen, makes you feel. Ryan Pierce sat there staring down at the expensive watch on his wrist. Moments ago, he had worn it with pride as a symbol of his success, his status. Now it felt like nothing more than an accessory. Across from him, Morgan Freeman remained calm, patient, allowing the weight of the moment to sink in. He had nothing left to prove. He had already said everything that needed to be said. Now the only thing left was for Ryan to decide what to do with it. Ryan cleared his throat, forcing himself to speak. "I don't know why I bought this watch." His voice was quieter now, missing its usual bravado. "I guess I thought if I had enough, I'd finally feel like I made it." Morgan gave a small nod. "And do you?" Ryan exhaled, looking around the room, at the audience, at the cameras, at the expectant faces waiting for him to respond. But for the first time in his career, he didn't care about them. He cared about the truth. "No," he admitted. "I don't." A ripple of murmurs swept through the audience. Some shifted in their seats, others nodded as if they understood exactly what he meant. Ryan glanced at Morgan's watch, the worn leather, the scratched glass. It was old, yes, but it had history. It had meaning. And suddenly Ryan realized something. "I don't have anything like that," he said. "Nothing that actually means something to me. Is everything I own. I bought because I could, not because I needed to hold on to it." Morgan's eyes softened. "Then maybe it's time you start." Ryan let out a slow breath. His fingers instinctively unclasped the expensive timepiece on his wrist. He turned it over in his palm as if seeing it for the first time. Then, without hesitation, he placed it on the table between them. The audience gasped. Ryan ignored them. His focus was solely on the man sitting across from him. "If I'm being honest, Morgan, I think I've spent too much time chasing things that don't matter." He looked up, and for the first time, there was no ego in his expression. No arrogance, just understanding. "So, tell me." His voice was steady now. "How do I start valuing the right things?" Morgan studied him for a long moment, then he smiled. "You just did." The audience erupted, not in laughter, not in shock, but in something deeper. Applause. Some stood, some wiped their eyes. They had come here expecting entertainment. They had witnessed a transformation. Ryan sat back, exhaling slowly. He had spent his career believing that power, wealth, and success were the ultimate measures of a man. But tonight, an old watch had proven him wrong. The cameras kept rolling, and what happened next? It was something no one, not Ryan, not the audience, not even Morgan, could have expected. Because at that moment, the world wasn't just watching a show, they were watching a man change in real time. Ryan Pierce had spent his entire career believing that power came from dominance, from being the loudest voice in the room, the one who could twist the narrative in his favor. But tonight he had learned something he never expected. Sitting across from Morgan Freeman, he had been stripped of his usual armor. His wit, his confidence, his control. And yet what replaced it wasn't humiliation. It was clarity. The applause from the audience had died down, leaving a heavy silence in its place. Ryan looked at the watch he had placed on the table, the watch that once symbolized success to him, but now felt hollow. He turned back to Morgan. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of genuine realization. "I've spent so much time measuring worth by things that don't last. And maybe it's time I stop." Morgan smiled, not in victory, not in condescension, but in understanding. "Awareness is the first step, Ryan," he said. What you do next, that's what really matters. Ryan nodded, his mind already turning over the possibilities. He had spent years tearing people down, judging them for their appearances, their possessions, but for the first time he wondered, what if he used his voice for something better? The camera zoomed in as Morgan lifted his old watch one last time, letting the light reflect off its worn face. Time will pass, whether we value it or not, he said. The question is, how do you want to be remembered? And just like that, the show ended. But for Ryan Pierce, this was only the beginning. Through this story, we realize that wealth, fame, and status mean nothing if we don't understand what truly matters. Respect isn't bought, it's earned. Success isn't about what we accumulate, but about the impact we leave behind. True power lies in kindness, in humility, in valuing people over possessions. The way we treat others defines who we are far more than the things we own. Because at the end of the day, material things fade, but the way we make people feel, that lasts forever.